Hello, dear friends. I'm trying to make up for videos which I did not do due to being slightly under the weather. The first one is for parshat Pinchas. Now, in parshat Pinchas, we have the very interesting story of the 5 daughters of TZlofchad who ask a question to Moses. And this is the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 26. And the daughters of TZlofchad came forward, and it says Vatikravna, they came forward, and they stood before Moses and Eleazar the priests, and before the heads of all of the assembly, in front of the tabernacle, the sanctuary, and they said, "Our father died in the desert, and he was not part of that group which rebelled against God," referring to Korach, "because he died of his own sin, but had no sons. Why should we lose our father's inheritance because he had no sons?" Because remember, the inheritance, even of the land, goes to the male children. And in general, and when it comes to inheritance, the firstborn gets 2 parts, and all the other males get 1 part. But the girls, according to the simple law, doesn't seem to get anything. But he had no sons. Let us have our father's land. And they asked Moses, and Moshe didn't know. And he turned to God, and God answered Moshe. He said, "Yes, this is correct. But the daughters of Tzlofchad said they should receive the land of their fathers. And in general, tell the people that if a person dies and he has no sons, it goes to the daughter. And if he had no daughters, it goes to the brethren. And if he had no brothers, it goes to his father's brother, to the uncle, etc." Now, what's interesting about this is actually one of 4 places where Moses was asked a question in the desert, and he didn't know the answer and asked God. Now, in a sense, we have here a description of what probably happened very often, but we only have 4 cases recorded in the Torah. And that is, people asked a question to Moses. Moses didn't have an answer, he asked God. It's almost like we have the oral tradition within the written tradition here, because the written tradition tells it what it tells us. But how did people know the other stuff? Like the written tradition says you're supposed to bind something on your hand and put something on your head between your eyes. But what is it? And if the written tradition doesn't know, then how do we know? So people will say, well, there's an oral tradition that explains it. Yes, but when did it start? As Maimonides argues, and I think it's very logical, it had to start from day one, because people had to know how to keep the laws. If it says in the Torah you're not supposed to work on Shabbat, what is the definition of work? If it says in the Torah you're supposed to bring a palm branch and a nice fruit and a myrtle branch, which is actually not called a myrtle, it's called anaf eitz avot, which is called the branch of an avot tree. Well, we know that's a Sukkot holiday, but 2 out of the 4 species are not explained in the Torah. How do you know which fruit it is? How do you know it's the etrog? So all these questions were obviously asked to Moses. Many of them he knew by himself. Sometimes he forgot. According to our tradition here, he forgot this and had to ask God. And other times, maybe he just didn't know and asked God, but it's not written in the text. So we have 4 places, and each one of these places, we have conclusive testimony. That's exactly what Moses did. He would ask God, God would give the answer. So people would ask these questions. I've always argued that the basic principles of the oral tradition of how to do must have been given from day one, and here we have the evidence. Now, there are 4 places in the Torah where this happens. Place number 1 is actually from the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, and I'll show you right here. In Leviticus, you have the story that says there came out among the Israelites, it's called the boy who blasphemed God. There came among the Israelites a man whose mother was an Israelite and his father was an Egyptian. And a fight broke out in the camp between this half-Israelite and a certain other Israelite. Huh. Excuse me. So, the question was what to do. The son of the Israelite woman pronounced the name in blasphemy. In Hebrew, kilel et Hashem, which actually means he blasphemed the name. It doesn't actually say blaspheme God, which is a very interesting thing, by the way. There's an interesting interpretation here. But it was brought to Moses, and his mother's name was Shlomit, the son of Divri, from the tribe of Dan, and he was placed in custody until God gave a decision what to do. Now, what happened? He wanted to put their tent in the tribe of Dan. But the people in the tribe of Dan said, well, your father was an Egyptian, so you're not part of our tribe because the tribe goes according to the father. And it says that the boy was very angry about this and he started to curse God. But it actually says he cursed the name. I don't want to go into that whole explanation what it means, but it's just a very interesting story. It's also a tragic story. You have a young man looking for an identity and he gets stuck between the tribes and he does what he does, which was, of course, very stupid. And Moses knew that he did something wrong. The only question was, what exactly was the punishment? That's what the Talmud says. And God said to Moses, yes, take the blasphemer out of the camp, etc., etc. And he got stoned for blaspheming God because anybody who blasphemes God shall bear guilt. Who pronounces God's name shall be put to death, etc. Very tragic story. But here you have the first story where Moses didn't know something. Here, according to the Talmud, it was actually just a detail. What penalty is it? Is it what we call karet, which is something after a person passes away, a punishment? Or was it something earthly? Turns out it was the death penalty and something earthly. Moses wasn't sure exactly the penalty. That is case number one. It's called the Mekamlel, the boy who blasphemed God. The second, all three other cases are in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar. Case number two is with the Mikoshesh Eitzim. This is brought down in Bamidbar, in Numbers chapter 9. Excuse me. Oh, yeah, I'm going to bring that as a second case because the Talmud claims that the man who chopped wood on the Sabbath did it at the same time of the boy who blasphemed God. And this is told in Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, chapter 15. When the Israelites were in the desert, this is verse 32, they found a man who was chopping wood on the Sabbath. And they brought him, and they took him to Moses and to Aaron. And in the meantime, again, they brought him to Moses and Aaron, and in the meantime, he was put in a holding place because it was not clear what to do. Now, this is also interesting. What was not clear? I'll tell you exactly what was not clear, and the Talmud says the same thing. In our tradition, there are 39 categories of work on Shabbat. Now, this Makoshe Shitzim was chopping wood on the Sabbath. Now, there's nowhere in the 5 books of Moses where it says you're not allowed to chop wood chop wood on the Sabbath. But if we assume that they had previously asked Moses what is allowed, what is not allowed on the Sabbath, he would have told them that there are 39 categories. And then the question is, when you're chopping wood, what is it? Is the problem carrying the wood? Is it tolesh, plucking? Is it harvesting? Is it, if you know the 39 categories? Is it a finished product? There's a lot of things that you could ask. You could have at least, the Talmud says there are at least 6 possibilities of which category this could be offending. So the Talmud says they knew he did something wrong. They didn't know exactly what it was. And they, again, or what the punishment exactly was supposed to be for it. And then God says to Moses in verse 35, he gets the death penalty and he will be stoned. Again, you have a story. They actually do know the problem, but it's not clear exactly what the punishment is. They have to ask God, etc. By the way, the Talmud says a very interesting thing about this wood chopper. Number one, the Talmud says he was TZlofchad, the father of those 5 daughters mentioned in our parshat of Pinchas. And secondly, The reason why he chopped wood on the Sabbath was not to desecrate God or the Sabbath, but when he saw that boy who blasphemed God, he figured people are not taking the Torah seriously. I have to show them that keeping the Sabbath is so serious, you could get the death penalty. So he purposely broke the Sabbath to get the death penalty in order to shock people into realizing this is a very important day. You cannot belittle it. By the way, according to our tradition, it was the second Sabbath that they ever kept. And it happened at that same time, right at the beginning, when they left Egypt in that first year. It happened the same time, that just after the boy blasphemed God, that TZlofchad, according to tradition, the Mikoshesh, the wood chopper, chopped wood on the Sabbath to make a point. That's called he died in his own sin. By the way, I want to explain, what does it mean? What point was he making? I'll try to explain this briefly. It says that this boy blasphemed the name. I mentioned that a moment ago. The name, what does it mean, the name of God? As the Kabbalists explain, we know nothing about God. God is infinite. God is nameless. He's called the Ein Sof, the infinite. So why is the Torah full of names? Names are how we relate, how God relates to the world. If I have a person that I know and I call him Joe, Joe is not his essence. Joe is when I say Joe, it's the sum or the total sum of all the interactions that I've had between myself and Joe. And that's what comes to mind when I say his name. So his name represents the interactions between him and myself. The names of God represent the interaction between God and the world. We don't know the essence. We only know the names. When the blasphemer blasphemes the name, it means I don't have a problem with God. I don't want God to relate to this world because I'm angry. TZlofchad says, no, the whole Torah is about God relating to the world. And the paradigm of that is the Sabbath, where we try to bring holiness into the mundane world. So he wanted to shock the people to realize that bringing holiness into the world is the main point of the Torah. And he shocked them by doing the wrong thing purposely, where they would have to punish him for it. Very tragic story too. Two tragic stories that happened in the same time. But in both stories, Moses is not sure. He has to ask God. By the way, according to the Talmud, and the Parshanim say this, commentaries too, in the story of the blasphemer, he couldn't remember. In the story of the blasphemer and the Mikoshesh and the woodchopper, Moses could not remember what exactly it was. And then he asked God. But now I'm going to the other two stories. The next story, which is brought in Bamidbar, also Numbers chapter 9, is a very unusual story about Passover. Well, the Jewish people kept the first Passover, meaning not the one in Egypt, a year later. But there were some people, this is chapter 9, verse 7, who came to Moses after Passover and said, look, we are impure. For whatever reason, they had to bury a relative or something. Again, lama nigara, they use the same term that the daughters of TZlofchad are going to use at the end of the book. Why should we lose out not to bring God's offering on the Passover? It's not our fault that we became impure and we had to wait for 7 days and etc. Moses didn't know, and he asked God, and God said, yes, tell the people of Israel, if somebody becomes impure or they were far away and they couldn't keep the Paschal offering, they can do it again a month later on the 14th day of Iyar, a one-time thing in the evening, on the evening of the 14th of Iyar. Now, the Talmud also says about this particular case that Moses forgot. Good. Now let's get back to our story. In our story, you have the daughters of Tzlofchad. That's story number 4. So why did I put in a different order than the biblical chronology? Because according to the Talmud, the story of the blasphemer and the story of the woodcutter happened at the same time, that first year. Whereas the 2 later stories are happening later, well, a little bit later, you might say. Pesach Sheni is probably also right at the beginning when I think of it. Take a look what it says. Excuse me. Pesach Sheni. According to this was the second year. Okay, so that happened in the second year. Okay, so there's the first year and there's also the second. Now, the daughters of Tzlofchad, what's happening there, it's happening in the 38th year. They're sort of like the black hole in the Torah. We have a lot about the first 2 years of the 40 years, a lot about the last 2 years. And in the middle, all those years are like a black hole. We know nothing exactly what happened. And it's not covered. So the daughters of Tzlofchad are at the end in the 38th year. And they ask Moses the question. But there's an interesting relationship between the ones who asked the question to Moses about Pesach Sheni, second Passover. Also, they use the term Lama Nigara, why should we lose out? Just like the daughters of Tzlofchad use that term, why should we lose out? Lama Yigara. But there's something very unique about the last 2 stories as opposed to the first 2 that I mentioned. The first 2, Moses basically knew the law. It was just a question of what the punishment was supposed to be. The last 2 stories, even though Moses forgot it, it was very different than the original. Meaning you have the first Passover and God comes along and teaches a whole new idea. There's a second Passover, which is possible if you were impure in the first one. That's not something you can infer from the script. It's something either you receive it in tradition or not. And the last case is the most interesting because for the daughters of Tzlofchad, and these are both cases, it says that Moses forgot, and the last 2 for sure, it says that for the daughters of Tzlofchad, when they asked if they can inherit, it's actually logical. In other words, it's something you can theoretically deduce from logic. If there's sons, the sons get it. If there's no sons, please give it to the daughters. No daughters to the brothers. It's a logical thing that you could deduce. Now to understand this, these are 4 cases where Moses is asking God to get help, which shows us the beginning that even in the written tradition of what we call the Torah, there is an oral explanation of how to do the things. Now, in general, when we talk about the oral tradition, the explanations of how to do things are also considered from the Torah. The way you put on the tefillin is part of the Torah command of tefillin, because if I don't know how to do it, it's not something different the way I learned how to do it from the fact that there's a command. The way I keep Passover is the command of the Passover too. So the explanation of how to keep it is part of the mitzvah itself from the Torah. That's not a rabbinic. A rabbinic tradition means the beginning of the oral Torah is, there are 3 parts of the oral Torah. As I said, the traditions of the beginning of how to, that's really part of the written Torah itself, even if it was given a lot of it orally. When we talk about the oral tradition, we mean the ability of the rabbis to deduce things logically from the text. We have what's called the 7 principles of Hillel, the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael, 33 principles of Yossi Aglili, how to deduce something from the laws, things that are logical. And out of the 4 examples that I gave, talking where Moses asked God, only the last one is a logical deduction. And actually, all of the commentaries say why couldn't Moses figure it out logically? If he was actually told it and forgot, logically he should have figured it out, especially if he was told in advance. This story, therefore, of the daughters of Tzlofchad is the story which is closest to what we call the oral tradition or the rabbinic tradition, because Moses could have deduced it from the from his own mind, but he preferred not to and asked God, and God said, of course, this is the way it goes. And God said, yes, they're saying the right thing. It's the only time out of the four when God says, they're saying the right thing, meaning their logic makes a lot of sense. And that's exactly the law. It's very interesting when you think of it. I call it the primordial beginning of the oral tradition in that sense. And now, I want to say one last thing, and that's the relationship of the written Torah and the oral Torah. And this will explain why this fourth story, or this fourth story of something that Moses didn't know and asked God, is done specifically by women. In Kabbalistic literature, the written Torah is called the sky, Shamayim, the heavens, and the oral Torah is called the land. Why? The Torah is given from God. But the oral tradition is how it's applied to the land, to the world that we live in. Also in Kabbalistic literature, the written Torah is called the man, and the oral tradition is called the woman. Now, women in general, by the way, have sometimes, when men deal with law, it's like, this is the law, you can't change it. A woman sometimes says, I know that's the law, but have a little common sense and you'll understand that it includes, okay. So that's the difference between the oral tradition and the written tradition. The written tradition, it is what it is. The oral tradition tries to make sense, sometimes in the application of the things. It's called the man and the woman. As it says in Proverbs, Shma b'ni b'musar avicha, v'al titosh Torah timecha. Listen, my son, to the teachings of your father, the musar, the rebuking of your father, and do not leave the Torah of your mother. Sometimes this is explained in this way. Why is it the rebuking of your father? The Torah says an eye for an eye, but the oral tradition says it's a monetary compensation. It's like the father who says, I want to hit him. And the mother says, don't hit him, send him to his room. The oral tradition tries to understand in the application how it's exactly supposed to work. It can use logic and inference to a certain degree, based on the principles and based on the traditions that we have. So these are the 5 daughters of Tzlofchad, where in their case, they already deduced it and told Moses what they thought in a very respectful way, and God said, that's correct. They said it right. Because this is what I call it the first example of the oral tradition, of deducing logically something from a Torah law. And they're women specifically, because the oral tradition and Kabbalistic tradition is called the woman vis-a-vis the man, which is the written Torah, the male and the female. And there are 5 of them, representing the 5 books of the Torah. And another interesting thing is right after this story of the Bnot Tzlofchad, when they asked this question, literally in chapters 27, verse 12, God tells Moses, this is time to prepare for you to prepare and die. So it actually is going to happen later, but Moses was told that. In other words, Moses, now that the beginning of the oral tradition has started, you who represent the written tradition, you have to stop and let the oral tradition now take over. It's almost like an idea which is happening here. There's more to say, but this is just an idea. I wanted to talk about these 4 places in the Torah where Moses is not clear to him the law. He has to ask God, and it also explains to us what happened over those 40 years, how Moses constantly was probably trying to figure out how these things are done, explained to by God, probably a lot of it right at the beginning at Chorev, and then how he explained it to the people over the 40 years. Shalom, shalom.